Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Saturday. Today I wanted to talk to you about breeding reptiles full-time and whether or not it's right for you, some of the pros and cons of doing so, and then at the end the strategy that I would employ to get there. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll know two things. Number one, whether or not it's right for you and something you should consider. And number two, you'll have the strategy in mind on how to get there, and it's probably not as hard as you actually think. Before we get into the video, make sure you check out creepycrawlyapparel.com, which is my reptile and animal apparel website. We have tons of cool gecko designs and snakes and a whole bunch of other reptiles. We have hoodies and shirts and stickers and a whole bunch of other cool stuff, including custom reptile apparel. So if that's something you're interested in, head over to creepycrawlyapparel.com and check it out. So is breeding reptiles full-time right for you? Well, I wanted to give you some of the pros and cons today, along with the strategy I would use to get there. I also wanted to make it a little bit different than some of the other breeding business videos that I've seen on YouTube, and I wanted to give you a different perspective on it. I am not a full-time breeder. I do it as a hobby. I breed crested geckos. This video applies to other reptiles as well. Just know that I'm going to be referencing crested geckos throughout, but it does apply. The strategy applies to any kind of reptile you can think of, so just keep that in mind. And I am not a full-time breeder, but you'll see why at the end of this video. So let's start out with one of the cons first, which is economic influence on the reptile industry. Obviously, if the economy is doing bad, people have less money, inflation's high, the last thing that they're going to be buying is things they don't need. And even though I love my reptiles, it's not something you really need to survive. So obviously that's a huge impactor and a slower on the market like we're experiencing with crested geckos right now. Another thing to consider though is supply and demand within your individual market. Ball pythons and crested geckos in particular are super flooded with animals, mostly due to probably people getting in around the 2020, 2021 time when things were booming. People were bored, looking for things to do. And if you haven't seen my crested gecko market crash video, I would highly recommend checking that video out, watching it, and then coming back to this one. It'll maybe give you a little bit more context to what I'm talking about. But also when this type of thing happens, there's also another kind of situation that occurs, which is basically a race to the bottom. So what I'm going to show you here today is a couple examples. So let's take a look at this crested gecko example here. I have two red phantom female crested geckos, both of them I produced here. One on the left has a couple little white spots, one on the right has a couple more, which makes it a little bit nicer, right? So we have these two, they're pretty similar, but a little bit different, right? And the thing with reptiles is you can't really change them once they're hatched. They're just the way they are. You got to sell them how they are. There's nothing you can really do. It's not something you build or anything like that. So let's say, for example here, I think this will help, that I wanted to sell you these two geckos. And I'm selling the one that's on the left side for $300. I'm Sam, little breeder, nobody really knows me, that kind of thing, right? And now your favorite breeder, think about your favorite breeder, they're selling this one on the right-hand side. It's a little bit nicer, and it's from your favorite breeder. You feel like, I could go buy this one from Sam and save $200, but I don't really know him. He's just kind of a rando. Or I could buy this one from my favorite breeder for $200 more. It's a little bit nicer, and I just really like the breeder, etc., right? And you decide, well, I'm going to buy the one from the nicer breeder. There's not too big of a difference in price. It's just a little bit different, and you think it's more valuable to go from a well-known breeder than little old Sam, right? So you buy the $500 one. Now let's change the scenario a little bit, and let's say it's that same situation. I'm selling the one for $300, but now your favorite breeder is selling the one for $1,500. Now you're looking at it a little bit differently. You're saying, well, there's a huge difference in what I'm getting versus the value I'm receiving. The value I'm receiving is pretty close together. I mean, I'm getting a red phantom. They're both pretty similar. Is it really worth the extra $1,200 to go buy from a big breeder? You might say, well, in this case, it's really not worth an extra $1,200. So now I am going to go buy it from Sam for $300. And so essentially what just keeps happening is the big breeders tend to price their geckos a little bit higher. In this case, we're talking about lizards. And so they'll price them higher. Smaller breeders have similar animals and they price them lower. And in a time like this, when there's downturn and people are looking to spend less money but get similar value, they tend to go for those lower animals where they can get the same thing they're looking for but at a lesser cost. So then what happens is the big breeders will continue to lower their price and get closer to those smaller breeders until eventually it's just a repetitive motion of people lowering their prices to be competitive, and then the next person will do it, and then they just keep going lower and lower and lower and lower, right? And so that's what we've seen a lot of in the Crested Gecko world. So that's a pretty big con in my opinion about breeding reptiles, is that there's no real way to add value after they've been hatched to make them at least hold or keep the price that they were at previously. And I can only tell you this from what I've noticed so far this year, but I would say from the last couple of years, Crested Gecko prices on average have probably dropped 20 to 30% overall. And then if you looked at higher end morphs like caps, fraps, axanthics, what else? Caps, fraps, axanthics, sables. I feel like those have at least, I know those have at least came down at least 50%, if not more. I mean, last year there was fraps that were 10 grand. Now you can buy one for $1,200. Caps were 10 grand. Now they're $600 in a single year. That's a huge decrease in price. So let's just say on average, it was 30% overall across the board. Crested Geckos came down in price from last year we'll use until this year. So how would that look like if you were a full-time breeder? Well, I have a good example here for you. So what we have is year, total revenue that you made, meaning the total amount that you sold, your expenses, and then the gross, or which was left over before taxes and other things like that. So we'll use that example of 2022. Let's say you made $100,000 selling Crested Geckos. Congratulations, you're in the top 0.001% of Crested Gecko breeders. And for expenses, I just rounded, I said 20 grand. This is going to depend a lot on where you live. Do you have a facility or is it in your house? How expensive is where you live? You know, a whole bunch of other different things like that. But let's just say it was 20 grand. So 100 grand minus 20 grand, that would leave you with 80 grand before taxes. Not too shabby at all. I think we could all wish we could get there one day, right? So that was last year, but how would it look this year now that prices have came down almost 30% on Crested Geckos alone in 1 year? So now in 2023, assuming you sold the same amount of lizards for the same prices, now you've made 70 grand. I left the expenses at $20,000, although in all reality, these would have likely went up year over year just because of inflation and other things like that. But for this simple example, we'll just leave it the same. So now your 70 has turned into 50, which really means that even though there was a decrease in the total top line of 30%, that means the total amount that's hitting your pocket before taxes is actually down 37%. So in a single year, you could have went from making 80,000 down to 50,000 before taxes. That's a huge decrease. So you got to ask yourself, if this were to happen and you were in this situation, would you be comfortable doing that? I think for most of us, if it was these numbers, we'd probably be okay. But if you're making less than $100,000, which most of us probably are, this would be a lot worse and could be potentially between you having to get another job, go back to work, that kind of thing, depending on where you fall in this, because just of how drastically it changed in a single year. So you might think to yourself, well, it's not that bad. If I wanted to make the same amount, it was a 30% decrease, so I just need to sell 30% more geckos. And I wish it worked that way. Unfortunately, when you have a decrease, the increase is not the same. So to get back to the same level of 2022, you would have to sell 43% more geckos in 2023 than you did the previous year. Meaning that if you had sold 250 geckos in 2022, you would need to sell 358 in 2023 to make the same amount, not even anymore, just the same amount as you did the previous year, which will then go back to our expenses, which are 20 grand. Now you're adding almost 50% more geckos. That's going to go up quite a bit. So really, you're going to have to sell even more to make the same amount of money. And I think this is a huge it is a huge con of breeding animals, and especially if you're in one particular market and not across multiple, which we're going to talk about later. But if you're in just Crested Geckos and that's all you're doing, this hit you really hard this year. I know, I remember thinking at the beginning of this year, man, I'm thankful I'm not breeding Crested Geckos full time, because I would have been stressed out thinking about this, knowing that all the prices are coming way down, and I'm, going to be struggling if I was breeding full time. But I'm not. I'm okay. I'm just saying it's something to keep in mind. Alright, enough of the doom and gloom. What can you actually do if you want to breed reptiles full time? If I haven't scared you away by now, you're set on breeding reptiles full time, what can you do to get there? Well, I have a pretty good strategy that I heard for a different business a while back, and I thought to myself at the time, man, that really applies to Crested Geckos well. I'm going to have to save that for later. So here it is. So in the middle here we have Crested Geckos, which is where I'm at, where you're at probably if you're watching this video. If it's another reptile, fill in the blank here in the circle in the center, right? And there's 5 ways you can go to grow your reptile business or your Crested Gecko business. And the first one of those is going to be up. So you can go up market, you can do higher end Crested Geckos. However, if you're doing just high-end crested geckos and kind of that lower end stuff, because you're going to get that even if you're breeding high-end animals only, you always pop out those lower end babies. The problem is of what I just described. You would probably be in an even worse boat if you had only bred high-end geckos, because those are the ones that were hit the hardest with over 50% decrease in price over the last year. So this would obviously not work on its own. Crested geckos and high-end only, you can do it. There's a couple people who do, but it's very hard, and you would have seen a significant decrease in your revenue this year if you had done that. So this is something to keep in market, though. You can always go higher end. And then the opposite of that is obviously you can go down market. You can start doing wholesale. I personally am not a fan of this approach either, just because I feel like it takes a lot of the fun out of breeding reptiles. Now you're just breeding them for the number. It's a numbers game. You're trying to produce as many as you can. You don't really care what they look like. You're probably going to be trying to sell the big box pet stores or other local pet stores or distributors. And I feel like this just takes a lot of the fun out of breeding reptiles, in which you're trying to get the coolest colors and combos and create the most beautiful animals possible. So I can't say I really recommend this one either, but it is something you could do. So this would be the vertical approach that you could take to a single reptile. You could go up, you could try and go higher end. You're always going to be in the middle because you'll always produce some, average animals, and then you could try and do wholesale. So this is the vertical to breeding reptiles. High end, middle ground, wholesale, right? Well, now you can go horizontally as well. And so for crested geckos, you could go in an adjacent step, or whatever animal you're breeding, you could go adjacently. So this would be something similar to crested geckos, different, but similar. So in this case, that would be your gargoyle geckos, your Leachianus, your Chahoua, your other New Caledonian geckos. It's kind of like a side step. So you could start doing crested geckos. Maybe you do crested geckos, high-end crested geckos. Then you go adjacent. You start doing gargoyle geckos, and then you're doing high-end gargs too. So now you're doing 4 different kind of things, but you're really just doing something similar. Leachies, gargs, something similar like that in this case of crested geckos. And this is a common step they'll probably notice if you look at your favorite breeder. They probably did a step similar to this. They probably started in one thing, did it really well, and now they're kind of sidestepping into other New Caledonian geckos. This is a common step for a lot of breeders. They start with cresties usually, and then they go into like gargs or leachies or chahuas, and then they'll try and also do that vertical for those. So they'll do like chahuas, high-end chahuas, gargs, high-end gargs, cresties, high-end cresties. You can probably make a full-time business doing this, because have high-end gargoyle gecko prices dropped 30% this year? I don't know, but chances are probably not. Have Leachianus gecko prices dropped 30% this year? Probably not. So if you're doing all those things, now you're a little bit safer, and the example I showed you earlier in the video might not be as severe for you. Yeah, crested geckos might have fallen off, but the other ones are doing okay, so you're doing okay. So this would be my next step. If I was breeding, I'm breeding cresties right now. If I wanted to breed full-time, I would start doing gargs. Obviously, you have to have enough cresties and enough cresty knowledge first. So maybe if you're expanding into a new place, this is when you start getting into other reptiles and stuff like that to make it a full-time gig. And just something to keep in mind is that there is people doing just one of these things and making a full-time living at it. Let's take a look at crested geckos, for example. Think about your favorite breeder. Do they breed just crested geckos full-time? Some of them might. There is a couple people who do it, but I can probably count the number of people who breed just cresties full-time in the United States and Canada on my 2 hands. There's probably less than 10 people who are doing just crested geckos in the United States and Canada and making a decent full-time living at it. Just being honest, it's pretty slim, just because the market share isn't that big. There isn't that much. I mean, it's possible, but very hard. You're better off, in my opinion, for the average person trying to go adjacently over time and branching into something similar but a little bit different. So enough about the adjacent. What else can you do? Well, you can go the opposite way. Once maybe you have the adjacent down, you can go broader. You can start doing other reptiles, snakes, amphibians, other stuff similar in the reptile realm, but not so similar. Now you're doing other reptiles. Maybe you're doing supplies. Maybe you're doing food. Maybe you're doing a whole bunch of other things. And this is when you start getting into a real big reptile company. So think of your Pangea. They kind of started with cresties and their food, so they were already doing the broader. But the thing is, for them, if we look at Pangea as an example, they hit a lot of these. They do crested geckos in the middle. They do upmarket on crested geckos and some of their other lizards. They do adjacent. They sell gargs, leechies, other reptiles, right? They go broader. They're doing supplies. They're doing food. And here's the thing. If you can incorporate one of these into your business, you'll be doing really well. And that is something that people actually need. As long as people have Crested Geckos, Pangea is going to be able to sell their food. I mean, it's something that people have to have. They need it if they're having Crested Geckos. It's just, it's something they need. They don't need a new Crested Gecko, but they do need food for it. So it's something that Pangea will always be able to sell as long as there's people breeding Crested Geckos. And I bet they make a lot more money selling their food than they do their geckos too, just because it's a recurrent thing that people always need. I bet they make a lot more off their food than they do all of their reptiles combined. So if you can incorporate one of those into your business, you'll be doing really well. Okay, so our final one is the one that I'm doing, and probably the one that's least likely to be able to be done as a full-time business, and that is to go narrower, meaning you're only going to be breeding lily white crested geckos. You're only going to be breeding red phantom crested geckos. This is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to go more focused just towards phantom crested geckos. And if I had to pick any of these that are the least likely to be able to be done full-time, this is definitely the one. There is just not a huge market for red phantom crested geckos. I would need to breed a boatload of them and probably start doing wholesale on them. There's just no way to do a specific niche morph of crested gecko, which is already a niche reptile kind of thing, and make a full-time living at it. I just don't see it. Maybe in ball python world you can, where there's a lot more people in that market than there are crested geckos. At this time with the crested gecko market, it just isn't possible, and that's why I am not a full-time breeder and I'm just a hobby breeder. I want to go very narrow. I want to focus on one thing. Maybe I'll make some side money at it, but doing it full-time I think is just kind of out of the picture at this point in time. So basically, just to recap, because I know this has been a long video, here's what I would do if I wanted to be a reptile breeder full-time. I'd look at my market, I'd look at what I'm doing right now, I'd look at how I could do it higher end, then go lower end, how I could do something similar, how I could go broader, and then maybe in the future go more narrow and really focus on something in particular and make it really nice. If I was just starting to try and make a business, I would probably look at my core thing that I'm doing, I would try and do it nicer, then I would go adjacent and do something similar, and then I would do that nicer, and then I would try and go broader and incorporate more things and create a real honest-to-God reptile company. So that's what a lot of your favorite breeders follow. They started out in one thing, went adjacent, went broader. That's how the majority of them go and how the majority of them probably will continue to go. I hope this video was helpful to you. I know when I first saw this chart, for me, it was like an aha moment. And I think if you did something similar and you just followed these steps over time with a lot of hard work, I think you could easily get there as well. I hope this video was helpful to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next one.